Hi, I'm Ian, and I'm the new Catholic. One of the things that I had to work through as I was considering coming into the Catholic Church from my evangelical background was this apparent discrepancy between, on the one hand, believing that in the Catholic Church, and really in the Catholic Church alone, was to be found the fullness of the truth about Jesus, and really the fullness of the presence of Jesus in this life. And then on the other hand, the recognition that many of my non-Catholic Christian friends, some of them very dear friends, have very real and vital relationships with Christ. They're obviously experiencing spiritual nourishment in their traditions and in their churches, but they're not Catholic. They don't have access to the fullness of the truth and the presence of Christ that's only available in the Catholic Church. How do I reconcile this discrepancy? And in fact, what kind of compounded that discrepancy was knowing that there were a lot of Catholics that I was observing who, if you measured their kind of spiritual vitality against some of my evangelical friends' spiritual vitality, frankly, they'd probably wind up coming up short. So I think there's a few things that we can say about this. And one of them is that the Catholic Church has been very clear and very explicit since at least Vatican II that the grace of God is very clearly at work in non-Catholic denominations and communities. So other non-Catholic Christians are very obviously participating in some measured way in the grace that is conveyed through Christ and through the sacramental life of the church. We have a shared baptism, and that shared baptism is a real and valid baptism, whether you were baptized in the Catholic Church or baptized in a Methodist church or a non-denominational evangelical church or a Baptist church. If you were baptized with water and with witnesses and with the words in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, you receive that grace that's conveyed to all Christians in baptism. So all Catholics should acknowledge that there is objectively real grace at work in non-Catholic Christian communities. But another thing that really kind of helped me work through this discrepancy was distinguishing in my mind between what I'll call the objective reality of faith and the subjective reality of faith. And in some ways, this distinction, I think, overlaps with the distinction we see in the Catechism between what we call the virtus fidei, or the virtue of faith, and the actus fidei, the act of faith. Maybe the best way that I can convey this distinction between what I call the objective reality of faith and the subjective reality of faith is through a metaphor. It seems to me that the truth of the Catholic Church is like this wide, deep river, right? The sacramental life of the church, the dogma of the church, is this wide and deep, life-giving river. And the Catholic Church is built right on the banks of that river. Now, over the centuries, there have been many, from Martin Luther to John Calvin to John Wesley to maybe your non-denominational pastor in the past few years, who've dug channels off of that river in various directions and maybe mixed in some other waters along the way as well. But there remains in those channels that these different Protestant and non-Catholic Christians have dug off of the river, there remains in there a lot of the life-giving water of the one river. And these, various other Christians have built their cities and towns along those channels. And when the people in those cities and towns, in a Methodist church or in a Baptist church or a non-denominational Christian church, when they drink deeply from the stream that they have access to, they often find good spiritual nourishment there. Because again, any of the truth that's conveyed, through the Bible, through the sacraments, through the dogma of the church, whether it comes through the mouth of a Catholic priest or bishop or not, it's true. And because that life-giving water, which is Christ, that's who we're talking about here, right? He is the life-giving water. Because that life-giving water is good and true, whether you drink it here or there, off one of these channels or at the great wide and deep river, you are going to be spiritually nourished by that water. And in fact, that spiritual vitality may outmatch the spiritual vitality of those who live right on the banks of the wide and deep river, but who only ever come to that river with a thimble to drink from. And what I mean is that the subjective reality of faith is how we come to the water that we have access to. The objective reality of faith is the water itself. How much, how broad and deep of a river do we have access to? That's the objective reality of faith. But the subjective reality of faith is really important too, and that's how we come to the water we have access to. And so I'm not surprised in the least when there are non-Catholic Christians who, having drunk deeply of the water they do have access to, experience spiritual vitality and maturity that outmatches that of many Catholics who they do objectively have access to the full truth and presence of Christ, but they don't subjectively bring themselves fully to it. And so what I've decided is just in my own life, I want it all. I want access to the objective breadth and depth of the truth and the presence and the goodness of Christ. I want access to it all. But I also know that I have to bring all of myself to that truth and that goodness to be changed by it, to become the saint that God has destined me to become. And so one of the very practical ways that I just try to implement this in my own life is at the beginning of every Mass, before the Mass begins, when I'm just sitting there in the pew with my family preparing myself, I'll pray a very simple prayer. It usually goes something like this: Lord, open me up subjectively to what I know you are doing here objectively. Because I know that in the Mass especially, Christ is going to come meet with me. He's going to meet with his church in the Word and in the sacrament in a way that is really the source and the summit of the Christian life, as Vatican II said. But I also know that I can be asleep when that's happening. I can be unengaged. I can fail to bring myself subjectively to the truth and the presence of Christ. But that's not what I want. I want it all. I want the objective truth and goodness of Christ in its fullness. And I want to be changed by it fully too. So I believe that people experience the truth and the goodness of Christ in many different places, not only inside the Catholic Church. And that's why we can often observe real spiritual maturity and vitality outside the Catholic Church. But at the same time, my hope is that if you truly are seeking Christ, that you will never settle until you have found the fullness of the truth and the presence of Christ that I believe you can find in the Catholic Church alone. I'm Ian, the New Catholic. Thanks for watching. Hit like or subscribe if you'd like to see additional videos as they come your way. And God bless.